Hi, and welcome to Compass Colloquium on Facts and Values. How does science inform democracy? We probably should have slid in there also science, how does it inform or fail to inform democracy? I'm Don Hubin, the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, the unit that runs the Compass program. This event is also co-sponsored co-sponsored by the Democracy Studies Group. You're getting a little too much there.
That's going to be great.
Okay.
Good.
So let me say a little bit about today's topic. Regardless of what your political commitments are or your inclinations, it's quite possible when considering controversial political and social issues to construe one's opponent as being scientifically ill-informed or willfully resistant to scientific evidence. Perhaps, at least until recently, attention focused mainly on what was dubbed then the Republican war on science, pointing to climate change denial and skepticism in the face of overwhelming consensus by climate scientists, or the skepticism about the or denial of the theory of evolution, despite the overwhelming evidence for that. But charges have gone the other direction in the political spectrum as well. As some on the right have charged that the aversion on health and safety grounds to all genetically modified foods, something that is found, I guess, more on the left than on the right, persists in the face of general scientific consensus that these foods are safe to eat. And the charge that one's opponent is anti-scientific or at best unscientific isn't confined to issues that neatly sort along the political spectrum either. Anti-vaxxers appear to be found across the spectrum, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence of the safety and effectiveness of vaccinations and the debunking of the research that called that safety and effectiveness into question. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence, if that's not an oxymoron, of politicians being ignorant of science and unwilling to defer to scientists on scientific matters. Perhaps one of the clearest examples is Representative Lamar Smith, a climate change skeptic who is the current chair of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. We have one presidential candidate who believes, or at least claims to believe, we should say, because he has taken some remediation effects at one of his golf courses, but claims at least to believe that climate change is a hoax foisted on a naive public by China. I can't say that quite right. China. Anecdotes aside, there's at least a widespread perception that politicians don't understand basic scientific principles. A few years ago, a group of British and Australian scientists published an article in Nature, 20 tips for interpreting scientific evidence, that aimed to educate politicians on those matters. And finally, of course, scientists often have very mixed feelings when their research breaks into the popular media. It's nice to be noticed, of course, but many scientists bemoan the way their research is oversimplified or misrepresented when it enters the public arena. So there's a lot of pessimism about the ability of the public in general and politicians in specific to have basic understanding of scientific research and so to base their judgments and policy commitments on that scientific evidence. To help us to understand the reasons why we and our political leaders fall short in this area, and more optimistically, how we can do better, we have two experts with us today. Dr. Ellen Peters is a professor of psychology and the director of the Decision Sciences Collaborative. She holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Internal Medicine. She received a BSc in Systems Engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and a BS in Economics from the Wharton School of Business at Penn. And unlike at least one other graduate of Wharton, I'm sure that she is an alumnus that they are happy to claim.
We hope.
I'm sure they are. Ellen received her PhD in psychology from the University of Oregon. She conducts basic and applied research in judgment and decision making. In her research, Dr. Peters focuses on understanding the basic building blocks of human judgment and decision making. She has three major strands of basic research. First, she studies how numbers are processed in judgment and decision making. A second central strand of research concerns how affect and emotion influence information processing and decisions. Third, she's interested in how information processing and decision-making change in complex ways across the adult lifespan. In applied research, she's also generally interested in issues of risk perception and risk communication in health, financial, and environmental contexts, including how to present information to facilitate its comprehension and use. Recently, she's been quite interested in the psychological mechanisms underlying tobacco use and prevention and how to nudge people towards healthier behaviors. And Mike Neblo, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, who also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Philosophy. Mike Neblo has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Mathematical Methods in the Social Sciences from Northwestern University. His research focuses on deliberative democracy and political psychology, and he also has interests in applied philosophy of social sciences, politics and the emotions, race politics, health politics, immigration, politics, technology, and the politics of arts. That sounds like a long and impressive list, but having worked with Mike for many years now, I know that he can make good on every single one of those disjuncts there, or conjuncts, I should say. They're quite impressive. And Mike is one of the founders of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, of which I'm now the director, and one of the core Compass organizers. So my role, here's how we're going to proceed today. We're going to engage our two experts in a conversation here, prompted by questions that I'll be asking them. And then we're going to open it up to all of you to ask questions and continue the conversation. My role in this will be as a naive layperson asking questions, a role that I'm eminently well qualified to play here. So let me start in this way. First, just to get some basics down, how bad are we at absorbing scientific information and making decisions based on good scientific evidence? And are we generally bad, or are we selectively bad at doing so? And why is it that we're as bad as we are? So either one of you wants to jump in and discuss that.
Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we've looked at this a bit in research in our lab, and there are actually, I wanted to actually answer the question starting off a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually really good in a lot of ways at processing scientific information, not necessarily understanding it, but understanding who the experts are and who we can rely on in order to make better decisions, because I'm often interested in decision making. So I'm interested in health decisions, for example. And so, I may not understand exactly how some medication works and how it does something for something that's going on inside my body, but I know my physician knows a lot, and I know that I can rely on that person as an expert. And so even understanding who the experts are is one aspect of understanding science that we're often pretty good at least in terms of the kinds of decisions that we might make on an everyday basis. We're generally bad in some other ways, though. Using scientific information in judgments and decisions is a pretty complex process. You have to understand the information. You have to understand the meaning of the information. You have to be able to make complex trade-offs between risks and benefits, for example. You have to, there's a lot of integration of information with each other and then with your own values and values and belief systems that you have. And some of that ends up creating some problems that we're probably going to talk about sometime today. But first, just in terms of the scientific information, one of the things about science is that one of the languages of science, one of the primary languages of science, has to do with numeric information. People often consider numbers one of the primary languages of science, but we're not very good with numbers in general as a public. If you look at data from various nationally representative samples around the United States, you'll find things like about half of Americans don't understand enough about numbers to be able to use the numbers that are used in printed materials, just like newspapers. About half of Americans can't do that very well. You can look at some specific questions, things like, and think about this for yourself, what you think the right answer is. If person A's chance of getting a disease is 1 in 110 years, and person B's risk is double that of A's, what is B's risk? Think about whether you might know that answer. College students are much more likely to be able to answer that than people who didn't go to college. But overall, about 46% of Americans answered that question incorrectly. It's a relatively easy question. And science is often a lot harder than that. And so we're just simply not very good with numbers. We also, another way that we're generally bad, just to go back to your question, is particularly when we don't understand the numbers, we often tend to use our emotions instead. And so with risks, if we're talking about climate change or some medical risk or terrorism, we often tend to react with fear. And we use that fear to decide what to do instead of trying to understand the scientific information that underlies it. There's one great example that was done, a study that was done by Gerd Gigerenzer. He looked at, after September 11th, he looked at whether people drove or flew more after September 11th. And it turns out that in the United States, a lot of people switched from flying to driving instead. Well, probabilistically, driving has a higher risk of death. And in fact, he estimated that about 1,500 more Americans died that year because they switched from flying to driving. They didn't understand the statistics, and they were driven by emotion instead. So that's one other way that we, that sort of sidelines our understanding of science to some extent. And that's we're selectively bad in some other ways too that that I think we're going to end up talking about around the idea that we try very hard to understand information, but we are also motivated information processors. We're not objective when we think and decide. We use our prior beliefs, beliefs about climate change, beliefs about all kinds of things, in order to interpret information that we might get, but also ultimately whether we use that information, or not. We use our preconceived notions. There's one great study with wine experts. I don't know if you guys might have heard about this. If you've taken my judgment and decision-making class, you have. But they had a group of wine experts, and they gave all the wine experts 2 glasses of wine to taste. One was a red wine and one was a white wine, and they simply asked them to describe the wines. And so they described the white wines and they described the red wine. The red wine they tended to talk about as, they described its jamminess and its crushed red fruit flavors. And it wasn't until afterwards that they revealed to the experts that they were both white wines. They'd simply colored the one of the white wines red. But that preconception of that belief they had going in that this is a red wine and this is a white wine changed how they tasted. They changed their reality of what the wine tasted like, even though they're actually the same wine. So those are some of the ways that we can be good in some ways with scientific information, but bad in other ways with scientific information.
Mike, you want to?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to thank Piers Turner is really the person who had the idea for this. So I want to thank Piers and Don and everybody for organizing it. And also just say that I'm really honored to be up here with Ellen Peters. I knew of Ellen before a little bit from the decision sciences stuff, but I've since read a lot of her papers, and I found that I couldn't stop, partly because it was a really, really long list of relevant papers, and partly because they were so great. So I'm excited.
I have to sit next to him more often. I suspect he has more coming, though.
No, I do have more coming, but it's just the truth. It's an amazing body of work. And on this first question, are we good at science, or are we bad at science? Is it selective? Is it general? Ellen's work so Ellen is one of the leading people in the world to answer that question. So I'm not going to try to get into the details on that. I'm basically say what she said. But I do have a few things. But I do have a few things to add, and it's on this question of, are we good at science, are we bad at science, in a first order sense or a second order sense? And by a first order sense, I mean really understanding and being able to engage critically with the science. My sense of the matter on that is that we're terrible as a general matter. As a matter of fact, there's a famous quote from Walter Lippmann that I really like. It runs something like this: on all but a very few matters for short stretches in our lives, the utmost independence, that is independence from experts, that we can exercise is to multiply the authorities to whom we give a friendly hearing. As congenital amateurs, our quest for truth consists in stirring up the experts and forcing them to answer any heresy that has the accent of conviction. In such a debate, we can often judge who has won the dialectical victory, but we are virtually defenseless against a false premise that none of the debaters has challenged. And I think the idea there is, now we're in a university, so this is a strange situation, but I can certainly say there's no straightforward sense in which I know that human-generated climate change is real. I believe that, I act on that, I believe I'm warranted in believing that, but in the sense of understanding climate models, and I'm a pretty numerate person and scientifically competent in my own domain. And the same is true for virtually all of these controversial domains of science. And so in a first order sense, I think we're pretty bad. But then there's the second order sense of being able to get the gist of the logic of an argument, if not being able to critically react to it, of feeling like that sense of trust is in place along with the gist and its congruence with my larger set of beliefs and commitments. There, my sense is, and I think this was Ellen's point, is that we're not too bad. We're generally okay, but there are particular circumstances where this goes haywire. And then the question is going to become, in the science of science communication, how do we help people remediate themselves when it goes haywire, and specifically haywire in a way that causes systematic harm either to individuals, directly to individuals, or their ability to make sensible decisions on behalf of others, especially, let's say, in the political domain.
So I think humans often flatter themselves. We have an image of how we reason about the world, and we tend to tell ourselves that we're actually doing that. And I think this picture is something like what philosophers talk about when they talk about philosophy of science and epistemology. And you might start with initial beliefs about the way the world works, and evidence comes in, and you update your beliefs based on that evidence, and you get more and more evidence, and that brings you closer and closer to an accurate picture of the way the world is. But it sounds like we're not really very good at doing that. Are there any other barriers to our operating in this idealized fashion that you haven't talked about already that you want to mention?
Sure. I mean, we've talked a little bit about numeracy. We've talked a little bit about affect and emotion. There's a whole series of heuristics or what we call mental shortcuts that people use as they try to make their way through this really complex world that we have. And the use of those heuristics sometimes means that we ignore science, but it also helps us make our way through the world, similar to what Michael was talking about. We get enough of the gist of what the science is in order to take some action. So we may not know the detail, and we certainly don't understand the models of climate change. I don't either. But we kind of know what we should be doing on a day-to-day basis, and so that's something else. We also, I mentioned this just briefly before, we also tend to persist in our beliefs. Whatever it is that we've believed ahead of time, it tends to color our understanding of what's to come and what it is that we're getting in, like the wine experts that I talked about. We'll even sometimes polarize beliefs when we're presented with facts that we disagree with, so that you might have these two groups of people, and studies have been done exactly like this, where, for example, one group believes is for capital punishment, another group is against capital punishment. You give all of them the same information about capital punishment. What's good about it, what's not good about it. Everybody gets the same information. And what you might think would happen from the perspective of this sort of rational processing of information is that you get the same information, so maybe people kind of eke a little bit closer together. Oh, I can see, I was against capital punishment, but I can see some of the benefits. Oh, I was for capital punishment, but there really are some problems with it. So you might think that people would come closer together. What they actually do is they polarize, or they can polarize at least, so that the people who originally were in favor of capital punishment become more so. And if they were against capital punishment, they become more so. And what seems to happen is we process information in ways that allow us to confirm what we knew all along. There's, as long as we're talking about quotes, there's a great quote by a social psychologist named Leon Festinger. And he says, it's about a man, but it could also be about a woman, for those of you who are female out there. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him the facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. And we can see that happen every day in the debates, of course, but in lots of other ways in real life, where we get information or you provide information to somebody and it disagrees with what they want to believe, and they suddenly question you about, well, how accurate is that really? Well, how well was that study done? Well, are you sure you trust that source? We question more when it's something we don't want to believe in the first place. And as a result, we end up selectively perceiving information. We also selectively expose ourselves to information. People who are liberal tend to watch one source of television. People who are conservative tend to watch another source of television, or read newspapers, or go to websites. We also selectively expose ourselves. And those processes of selective perception and selective exposure to information mean that we confirm what we wanted to believe all along, so that we can continue, so we can maintain in our belief systems. So that's another one.
Mm-hmm.
So this might even be a point of, not exactly sharp disagreement, but a difference in emphasis.
Yeah.
The body of research that Ellen's just referring to in terms of persisting in our beliefs, polarizing in our beliefs, I have a somewhat different take on, and some of you out there who know me might think that it's an example of believing what you want to believe, since I'm a sort of committed, deliberative Democrat. But do with that what you may. So let me say, I certainly think there is such thing as politically motivated reasoning, and I do think that the phenomena is not imaginary. That said, I think a lot of the evidence that we have for this is less strong and at least interpretively ambiguous toward much more benign, even benevolent interpretations that we use heuristics. There's something in statistics called the bias-variance trade-off, and we use certain simple decision rules, let's say on who to trust, that could actually conduce towards accuracy, given our larger set of commitments and beliefs. Similarly, the part of belief persistence and some of these other phenomena, I think, are an attempt for people to be coherent in their thinking. And coherence is an unimpeachable sort of cognitive virtue. And that without understanding something that's technical in this field called the priors problem, meaning people's prior exposure to information and how strongly they believe something ahead of time, it's not clear that this evidence is actually evidence of perverse reasoning, even in what seems like a really damning situation, for example, of polarization. Under those circumstances, let's say I believe in evolution, and I'm confronted with new evidence from intelligent design scientists. It might be the case that I had some prior notion out there that these intelligent design scientists actually had some data, and they actually had some intelligent people sort of supporting their view, and then I hear it and I say, is that all you've got? Under those circumstances, it's perfectly sensible to observe polarization. It can be an entirely rational updating process. And so when we take into account the priors problem, when we take into account the bias-variance trade-off, when we take into account coherence, and the notion that in my mind, the only really clean results showing politically motivated reasoning are lab results. That there aren't, to my knowledge, any really clean studies in naturalistic settings, primarily because of the priors problem. And then we have a potential problem moving from the lab into the field, that we don't actually have that great of a notion of how and when this problem, i.e. the public systematically being inaccurate, consequentially inaccurate in their views, we don't have that great a sense of the scope and depth of the problem. I concede that it is a problem, that it is something that's out there. But when Piers and I were first talking, it was sort of in the context of saying, oh my God, the public is so bad that maybe a certain amount of technocracy or in practice elite-oriented politics and policy might be more sensible. And the one thing that the single most important thing that I'm concerned to try to convince you of today is that we should A, be very cautious about that, and B, that the evidence for it is not as deep and as broad as is often thought. It's real, but the scope of the problem, it seems to me, to be indeterminate. And that under those circumstances, we should err on the side of sort of robust democratic input. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would, I want to start off just by, there's a piece you said early on that I wanted to emphasize, and it's the idea that when we get new information, when we have a prior belief and we get new information, we don't replace beliefs with new information. We adjust them, and that was sort of the point that you were making early on. In the polarization kinds of cases, we're becoming more extreme. But I would agree with you. I'm not sure how much evidence I've seen out in the real world of that, and those are definitely lab studies. And in particular, I believe those are done with college students too. Not that y'all aren't real, but you're a very select cream of the crop across the United States. And so how much that generalizes to other populations, I don't know the data on that. Maybe someone else in the room who's looked at that might know some more of the data there. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, I'm not sure how clean that distinction is between the lab and the field. So let me give you an example. Cass Sunstein he's a guy who wrote the book called Nudge, for those of you who might know that book, and he was the regulatory czar of the United States for a period of time. And he's generally just a very smart guy. He's a lawyer. He works in kind of in the field of sort of behavioral law, where he works at the intersection of law and decision making, if I'm to put very broad strokes on it. He did a study recently where they looked at how new information alters people's belief. Now, it was done on the internet. It's not the lab, but it's not quite the real world either. But I'll be curious what you think about the differences. Like, where do you call something the real world? Because it is about people's beliefs. So it was done up on it's done on the internet, and it turned out that when you gave new information to people, that whether it altered your beliefs or not depended on whether the new news helped you to uphold your prior beliefs or not. So the area that they were looking at in particular was human-caused climate change. So for those people who didn't believe in human-caused climate change, if he provided them with unexpected good news, that the temperature is going to rise less than they thought. So these are people who don't believe in human-caused climate change. They don't think that the temperature should be rising because they don't believe in it. You suddenly give them information that the temperature will rise less than was previously thought. It caused them to change their beliefs about future temperature rises. But if you provided them with unexpected bad news, the temperature will rise even more. It caused no change in their beliefs. They didn't change at all. They believed one set of information, but not the other. Unless you think, because I suspect a lot of you are probably liberal, or some of you at least are probably liberal, lest you think it's limited to conservatives, liberals show the exact same effects, just in the opposite direction. It's the exact same asymmetry in belief change. If the incoming information agreed with what they wanted, their beliefs changed in the direction of the incoming information. But if it disagreed, no change. And so there's this, in some ways this is the real world. We have beliefs and we get new information, and there's this huge asymmetry in what we pay attention to, what we change, what we question and what we don't question, what we trust and what we don't trust, even in this case when it's presumably coming from the same source.
Right. So I can't remember the details of the Sunstein paper, so that's great. And I think it's really getting us right to where the rubber meets the road. But before I jump into that, I do want to say I've done lab work myself. I'm in no way dismissive of lab results, especially on basic cognitive processes. And but I do think the priors problem adds to the complications of making inferences. And I've done lab work, but I've also done lab work with when I put it out into the field, I've actually gotten reversed results. So I'm sometimes just cautious about this. So on the Sunstein paper, the tricky thing is now was the attribution of the source of the information, was it manipulated to be congruent or was it neutral?
I think it was just neutral.
So it was
I don't
neutral?
think they provided any source
That's right.
information.
Okay, great. Now I could see a study where I would concede on this, but if you're not manipulating the expectation, so if you're also manipulating Nixon goes to China, a situation where a highly reliable source tells you something counterattitudinal, a source that you expect to be congruent with your own beliefs and values is telling you something counterattitudinal, and you still saw this selective resistance, that seems to me to be very problematic. The pattern that Sunstein describes, I think, is potentially problematic, but we're not really quite sure, because what we're doing is simultaneously making an inference about the reliability of the source and the substantive judgment and trying to bring that into coherence. And it doesn't seem to me to be crazy if I have no ability or very limited ability to directly judge the credibility of the science itself, to say, depending upon the sort of strength of my priors, to say, well, you know what, that's probably done badly. So there's the famous example in psychology not that long ago on ESP. And there's a debate, I think a fascinating debate in the philosophy of science and statistics, philosophy of statistics, on whether the journal editors, so there was a paper published showing that some people apparently had ESP powers. It's since been not replicated. It's been repeatedly unreplicated. Yes. It has since been replicated, unreplicated many times. But there's an interesting question as to why the editors didn't just say, you know what, I accept what you did at face value, but my priors are so overwhelming against the plausibility of this mechanism that I'm just gonna discount it. And it seems to me that citizens in a situation where, let's say the editors didn't have access to the data, they didn't have access to the details of all these sorts of things, that even in a scientific context, oftentimes we're moving on trust and we're moving on sort of really core principles. And it seems to me that it's not facially unreasonable for citizens to say something like, if this is moving against me, that there's some reason to think that the source, that this is probably funded by the Koch brothers, or it's probably funded, the finger was on the scale towards liberal academics, and academics are liberals. Now, I want to emphasize that that's not really my view, and that I would like to persuade my fellow citizens elsewise, but it's not a formal violation of rationality. It seems to me that that's a substantive argument that we have to make for people, that they should have more baseline trust in science, that they should put weaker priors on the sort of ability to update off of information, on source reliability, things along those lines. That it's not a technical violation of rationality, but rather something that we in the scientific community have to do a better job of in terms of engendering trust and source credibility in scientists. And the science of science communication, which is one of the things Ellen is contributing really important work to, it seems to me is one of the most important things out there. And so in that sense, I think I very much agree with you, but I disagree in the emphasis, in the sense of whether it's a formal violation of rationality that we know is wrong, or rather it's something that we worry doesn't pass a sniff test of a sensible way for a democratic public to function. And I think it's the latter. So in that sense, I agree, but in terms of demonstrating irrationality, I actually don't think it does.
So I think part of what you're bringing up is a little bit of what we started with, this idea that science is really hard for people. There is a reason we have scientists. Our world has become so complex, we can't possibly have the expertise to understand everything about medicine, about climate change, about any of a myriad of topics that ideally we would know, but practically we're not going to. And so to some extent we have to rely on trust, as you're saying. And in fact, there is even data, and I think this is in climate change, it might be in gun control, but it's a study by Dan Kahan. It might be in nanotechnology, actually. It's in a politically divisive domain. I'm going to pretend it's climate change. I don't remember for sure what the politically divisive domain is, but the point of the study, the actual topic kind of doesn't matter, so long as you know that it's a politically divisive topic. On this politically divisive topic that we're going to pretend is climate change, liberals think one way and conservatives think another way. And we know from other studies that you can, that as a result, if they get new information, you're going to see people change only if that information tends to agree with what they want ahead of time. What he did was a little twist on that. He provided people with information that went against their prior beliefs, and so then you'd expect no change, right? Except he did something funny. For the conservatives, he presented a picture along with the information of a guy in a tie, about 50, 60 years old, looking very corporate, and someone who would really appeal to someone who's conservative. And suddenly the beliefs changed to some extent, and probably because of trust.
Yeah.
And with the people who are more liberal, they presented, we lived in Eugene, Oregon for a long time. I don't know if you guys know Eugene, Oregon, but it's very crunchy granola, a lot of tie-dye. Yeah, you know it a little bit at least. Yeah.
Patchouli oil.
What, say it again?
Patchouli oil.
Patchouli oil is everywhere. A little more showers would be desirable, but that's another story. And so what they did for the liberals is they presented, again, information that was incongruent with what they wanted to believe, but they put a guy who looked like he was from Eugene, Oregon next to it, and suddenly their beliefs changed a little bit because they could trust, as you're pointing out, they could sort of trust that source of information a little bit more. Now, you talked about this idea, I think I'm actually gonna mostly repeat what I think you said.
Okay.
The formal violation of rationality, I don't care.
Right.
What I care about is people should believe in the best scientific data that we have available because we have crises facing our nation and our world. And what's happening is they're not trusting the scientists. They are, sometimes if it looks, if I could dress up in a nice suit and deliver some bad news to somebody, maybe they'll believe me a little bit more. But there's, I'm not even sure what I think about the formal violation because I just don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
In the end, when we're trying to communicate information about science, you want people to believe the best available science. You want them to understand, too, that science changes. Science is always about two steps forward and one step back because there's lots of uncertainty and complexity involved in that science. So you do want them to understand that, too, and to take that into account when they're trying to decide how much to adjust their beliefs. But you do want them to use the best science because we want to come together as a nation and come up with solutions for some of our big problems. And so I appreciate your point, but I think you are also making it the same point that I am, that in the end, what we want is for people to be able to use the best science. And that means we have to do a better job communicating it.
That's right. So here's the sense in which I think it's important, even though I'm not necessarily disagreeing, is that I think that there's reasonable, or at least not crazy, disagreement about how reliable science in the scientific community is. I'm a practicing scientist, so on this we don't really disagree. So on the one hand, I agree that my bottom line is that people should be trusting and acting on and making inference that are correlative with the best available science. But there's an open question of what the best available science is and how reliable that is, that most of the people in this room, because we're attached to universities, so for example on the left, there are people that really get freaked out about the idea that 85% of military officers are very to extremely conservative, and they think that this is a dangerous thing. Now, a lot of people say, look, we have civilian control of the military, the officers are told what to do, right? The flip side worry that I don't worry about personally, but I don't think you have to be crazy to worry about, is that the professoriate, the academy, are skewed left, and skewed left powerfully, in a way that makes people who aren't part of the academy not unreasonably worried about how much they can trust science. And it problematizes the notion of what the best available science is. Now, I don't personally question that very much. What I'm saying is that I think we have to reach out to people who don't have to be crazy to question that more than we do. And that's what I meant by the difference between not making a formal rationality violation and a substantive one, and why I think it's important, why that distinction is important, that we have to acknowledge that those people are not crazy to be a little less distrustful, or a little less trustful, excuse me, and that we have to take account of that in the science of science communication. And I don't necessarily think you disagree. I was just trying to clarify that I wasn't making a nitpicky point, or what I don't think is a nitpicky point about formal versus substantive. It's that I think that that distinction is important for the sociology of scientific uptake.
Yeah. So I would agree with you because we're having some problems with communicating science to people who come from a different side of the political spectrum.
That's right.
I don't know how much you guys know about climate change, but the current evidence is that about 97% of climate scientists have believed that climate change is not only happening, but it's human caused. But you get some other kinds of numbers. Nicholas Kristof talked about this in the New York Times. Only about 44% of Americans, this is back in 2014, only about 44% of Americans believe humans are causing climate change, versus about 77% of Americans who believe that aliens have visited Earth. And so we have some difficulties in science communication that do need to be overcome.
So you've both spoken about decision heuristics, and for the most part we've been talking about ways in which our heuristics might not be unreasonable to use when we have a lot of information and we're not skilled at dealing with some of this information. They might be second-best solutions. It'd be best if we could be, understand all the science, make the primary judgments, but we can't. These heuristics, though, I mean, they manifestly lead to error in some cases, right? I think that's uncontroversial that we have decisions.
They can.
Right, there are certain contexts. I mean, the Kahneman Tversky results about probability judgments and so forth lead us to think that. But presumably they evolved for a reason.
Yep.
And some of that reason is how do you make good enough choices in an epistemically impoverished or a computationally impoverished situation and so forth. But it strikes me that there are other reasons why certain decision heuristics might have evolved. They might have evolved to cement social solidarity, and some of the comments you just made here suggested that. I mean, one thought is when you look at the person when the businessman looks at the person who's dressed like a businessman, he thinks, oh, that's a credible source, When the professor looks at someone with, the corduroy jacket and the patches, or whatever.
It feels like home.
Yeah, right. But so part of it might be that we think there's credibility, but part of it might also be that's my clan, that's my group,
Yeah.
right? And we cement solidarity. So I may be asking you to go outside your comfort zone, and I'm not really asking you to do evolutionary just so stories, but what do you think about the possibility that some of our heuristics that we employ for making judgments about the world are selected not simply because of their reliability overall, but because they perform some other function that's important for social species?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would frame it in a slightly different way. Belongingness is one of the most important key drivers of who we are. I would guess everybody out there at some point has felt like they didn't belong, and it's horrible. It's a terrible feeling. We all have a drive to belong. But I would think about that as just one of our primary motivations. So we do have motivations to be accurate. We have motivations to not get overwhelmed by all the stuff that's around us, the options, the information. And then we have one of these primary motivations is simply to belong. And some of our cognitive shortcuts are intended to help us make our way through a complex world and meet our goals. And one of those goals is belonging.
Right.
And so I'm not sure if I need to get back to an evolutionary argument or not. Maybe evolution produced this motivation
Yep.
to belong. But our cognitive shortcuts are simply the result of living in a world that's far too complex for us. It has too much information. It has too many options that it presents to us. We are Herbert Simon's words. Herbert Simon won the Nobel Prize back in 1977. He talks about us as being boundedly rational. We are capable of great feats of intellect. We can model climate science. But each of us as individuals is also boundedly rational. We can only do so much. And as a result of that, we use mental shortcuts to help us make our way through the complex world. And the shortcuts are intended to help us meet our goals, to help us get to what we want. And one of the primary things we want is to belong. There are other ones too, but that's one of them.
It sometimes seems that certain beliefs that people have and profess are, they seem to outsiders preposterous on the face, but they signal to others that you're a member of that group. So I think beliefs about those things might be relatively impervious to evidence if you feel like it's going to threaten your belonging to a particular group. That's the sort of thing I was thinking might be involved here.
I mean, we've actually done a little bit of research in this around climate change and also in the domain of nuclear power, where we've looked at the idea that people's political ideologies are associated with their risk perception. So that people, when it comes to climate change, people who are more conservative, they tend to perceive much less risk from climate change. People who are more liberal tend to perceive much more risk. And it drives experts crazy because experts want us using the facts. And so we went in to test this idea that the experts think that lay people, in a sense, are kind of dumb. They're using heuristics, they're innumerate, they're scientifically illiterate, they're boundedly rational. But that whole line of reasoning would suggest that people out in the public who are more scientifically literate and who are more numerate should therefore, by default, perceive more risk from climate change. We actually see a little bit of the opposite. People who are more numerate and more scientifically literate actually perceive a little less risk. It's not a lot. It's a very small relationship, but it's there. And so maybe the problem there is that we just haven't done a good enough job communicating science. and we've miscommunicated to these people who are scientifically literate and scientifically numerate. So we can kind of maybe back off of that. We haven't done a good enough job with scientific communication. But then maybe what we can do is we can think about the idea that, okay, if people are driven by these political ideologies to some extent when it comes to the risk perceptions, at least the people who are more scientifically literate and numerate, they should come together on the facts. It might be the wrong ones, but they should come together more on the facts. And the people who are less scientifically literate, I'm going to get these words right eventually, less scientifically literate and less numerate, they're the ones who should really be driven by these ideologies. Except that it's the opposite. It's people like you and me who have gone to college, who are scientifically literate, who are relatively numerate. We are the ones who are more driven by our political ideologies. And what it comes back to are these motivations. There is this motivation to belong. That is one of our primary motivations in life. Okay, I should back off. This is what we think the explanation is. We don't have great data. We don't have great process data on this, but this is what we think is the explanation. That we are motivated to attain our goal states, that being part of my tribe is one of my goal states, and people who have more ability are better able to attain their goals. They have more resources to torque the data. We have more resources to question data that disagrees with us and agree really strongly with data that does agree with us. And as a result, we think that people go for their primary motivation to belong in this case when they have a lot of ability, because they can, because they can attain that motivated state. And what they leave behind is what's best for society, maybe, and that belief in science. And that's one of the things that we really have to try to overcome when it comes to some of these societal issues, is our great ability to torque the data how we want.
So I'd like to turn to the question, maybe to solutions more, and to the question of...
Could I make a short response
sure, yeah,
to that?
Absolutely.
So, that is one possible explanation. I agree that it's a very plausible one. But there are others. One of them, could be priors. The strength of priors and the extent to which you've processed information is going to systematically vary, probably positively co-vary with literacy, scientific literacy, numeracy, and these other sorts of things. In addition, kind of speaking to Don's question, belongingness is clearly a powerful drive and is a plausible explanation here. It also seems to me that it's observationally almost equivalent to cueing off of and trusting the collective intelligence of your community of trust. In what sociological terms is often called your life world, and offloading some of your reasoning to your community of inquirers. And we do this all the time, even in science. We do this all the time, and so one possibility is that this is just a folk version of that outside of science, that people reasonably, again, it can go wrong. It can definitely go wrong, but there's a bias-variance trade-off, and that they reasonably use as a heuristic, and that a lot of the evidence, not all of it, Don has this one unpublished paper that I really think starts to nail it, but a lot of the published evidence it's observationally equivalent to these alternative explanations, and the alternative explanations don't strike me as desperate, they strike me as plausible. So I'll just toss that out there, which is not to say that it's not also we want to belong, and we don't want to be taken to task by the people in our group. That is utterly plausible too, but I don't think it's a settled question.
So how does our ability to absorb and rely on good scientific information change depending upon the context in which the information is presented to us, whether we are in a group of like-minded or a group of mixed-minded individuals, whether there is an expectation that we will have to give a rationale for the positions we hold and so forth? How do those factors affect our ability to take up the information?
It's huge. And
huge.
It's huge. And Ellen and I were talking a little bit about this, and we both sort of study the same phenomena, but at different levels. Ellen's work is primarily individual level. I look at group dynamics. But as I said, I've now read a lot of Ellen's work, and I think she would say the same, that the context is pretty important, and the accountability, there's a lot of things that could really affect outcomes. At the group level, it's enormous. That if you're in homogeneous groups, the tendency to polarize is vastly higher. If you're in cross-cutting groups, especially I studied deliberative democracy, so forums where there's sort of norms, implicit norms that are being activated, and defeats a ton of the cognitive biases and polarization problems. When you just switch very subtly, I claim that the mechanism runs something like this. That when we're in an individual context, especially around political problems, we're often implicitly being asked, or we interpret the question to be, what do I want? When we're in a deliberating group, the question implicitly shifts to, what should we do? And we know from framing experiments that much less dramatic, forbidding versus not allowing can cause 30-point swings in people's responses. Moving from what do I want to what should we do can cause a sea change in people's behavior and their cognitive processing, both the processing and the outcomes. And I think, and in a moment, Ellen will speak to this, but my sense that this is a really important question because the outcomes can just be really quite dramatically different depending on the context, either monological at the individual level or at the group level, and at the group level, whether you have cognitive diversity and attitudinal diversity, and then frames and norm activation. It's just a whole raft of things that powerfully affect outcomes and the quality of the reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think you were going to end that quickly.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Sorry, we won't bore on.
So I think the group stuff is fascinating. It's not something, I've read a little bit of your work at this point, but I'm a psychologist. I study individual people. I don't treat anybody, by the way, don't come ask. No treatment here. But I study how individuals process information. And I do that despite the fact that I know a lot of things happen at the group level. In medical decision making, it's sometimes a single patient, but it's sometimes a single patient with her daughter or her husband, or we often actually are making these kinds of decisions in group settings. We don't study them very often in psychology. And so I really find this idea that cognitive biases, if the group is set up appropriately,
Right, that's true.
that these cognitive biases may decrease quite a bit actually
Yeah.
from some of
Right.
your work. And not only that, you hadn't mentioned this, but they even persisted over time.
Yes, up to 4 months.
4 months. Okay, I was trying to remember the number of
Yeah.
months. I couldn't remember. So up to 4 months even. I mean, I wonder, and I'll be curious as your work continues, what happens as more time unfolds, because part of the reason that the kind of social norms exist and persist and wouldn't allow that is because the group punishes the individual if they go outside. So imagine that you're somebody who is really, really conservative, and suddenly you believe in climate change and you believe that it's human caused. There's actually a former senator from South Carolina who came to visit us about a year or so ago who did exactly that. He is extremely Republican, extremely religious. I'm totally forgetting his name right now. What's his name? Bob Inglis. So Bob Inglis switched, and he became a climate change believer, despite the fact that he's very, very conservative. He has been ostracized.
He lost his seat.
He lost his seat.
He got challenged from the right.
But the
People don't return his calls.
I mean, it's actually in
That's
talking
terrible.
with him about it, it's been really painful because he's lost a lot of his tribe, essentially. And so I'll be curious what happens as you look at this research over time. My guess is that part of it depends on part of the effect of those cognitive biases going away in the group setting happens for people in the middle, when they're not too strongly associated with one group or another.
Yeah.
And that if they're very strongly associated with the group, and therefore their friends and their compatriots are very strongly associated with one of those groups, that maybe it doesn't work as well, or maybe it doesn't persist as long. But I'm really curious, actually. I think it's great if it would. That'd be
Yeah.
one great part of the solution.
So I have some very preliminary work that I've done on building groups in existing social networks. So heretofore, most of the research that I've done are groups of people who don't know each other well. But I've now got some work on people where I know who's friends with whom, who really respects whom we gathered, who has trouble getting along with whom. We gathered multiple social networks. And it turns out, perhaps unsurprisingly, that their sensitivity to to the pre-existing social networks, having to do with trust, having to do with the ability to change one's mind publicly, and we're coming up with designs. I should consult with you because you're a better experimentalist than I am. We want to come up with designs, for example, where we have groups that are homogeneous, cliques that are deliberating, that are homogeneous both socially and attitudinally, but then it's easy to construct groups that are cross-cutting attitudinally, but socially homogeneous, heterogeneous on both. You could have a broker, somebody who's friends with people in each group. Really the sky's the limits on these experiments, and that's one of the, and these groups we can follow up to 4 years. They're college students, but we are hoping to be able to answer some of those questions. So I don't have good answers yet, but we are beginning to think through how to be able to answer those questions, because they're tricky ones.
Yeah, that's cool.
So I actually have a few more questions, but I think we should open it up to questions from the audience. But could I first, Lav, could you bring up a couple more waters for people here? So let me invite you to ask questions, and yes. We have a microphone coming, don't we, Steve? Yes. We're recording this. We want you.
Check. Hello? Hello?
Yep.
Okay. So I recognize that our two-party system sort of needlessly dichotomizes a lot of issues in American politics. And I'm wondering if multi-party systems, say in other countries, perhaps Europe and Germany, if there's better understanding of scientific knowledge given multi-party systems and how they frame issues.
Great question.
Great question.
Yeah,
So he knows maybe part of it, and I should know the other part.
My worry is that could end up being confounded, but let me put it this way, somebody should do a careful design on that. It's a terrific question.
But part of it you'd actually have to find issues that are polarized in both places, so
Right.
that you could use the same issue and ask the same questions. And I'm trying to think of issues that are polarized in both places. Nuclear power is not, climate change not, GMOs not. We're a lot more polarized here than Europe is. We just got back, my husband and I just got back from Amsterdam, so we spent a bit of time first describing that no, most Americans don't necessarily like Trump. But second, talking about where are things polarized and how is the polarization different. And I didn't come to a clear understanding of, and maybe someone in the audience knows, of an issue that's kind of equally polarized in both places, because you would need that to be able to answer your question. Say it again. Immigration.
Yeah.
Immigration.
Another one that I have partial knowledge of. So there was a court case in Germany over genetically modified organisms, and it was basically the Greens versus the Christian Democrats. This is colleagues in Germany who studied this, and the really cool finding out of that is that when you were talking about elites, so officials of the Green Party and officials of the Christian Democrats said yes, we're going to support business, and the Greens said no, we're going to oppose GMOs. And the court actually remanded it partially to social scientists to convene citizen consultation on this. And it was really fascinating. The average citizens, even if they were members of the Green Party or the Christian Democrats, the Greens kind of said, well, I don't like GMOs, but I don't like pesticides either. And GMOs allow you to reduce pesticides. And on top of that, I'm also red, not just green. And banning GMOs and pesticides mean that food prices go through the roof. And I don't want poor people, that differentially, hurts poor people. And the same was true among the non-elite Christian Democrats. They were much more, maybe this is it, that I interpreted it a little bit differently. I thought that the officials, in a sense, had a responsibility, in a sense, to the group. But maybe it was fear of ostracism, that they were much more embedded in a way that could affect their personal costs and benefits. And that's observationally equivalent too. I don't know whether it's merely they feared ostracism or whether they thought they had a role morality responsibility to say yes, 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 or no, no, no. But the interesting part was the average citizens did not.
But not just rejection from the group, but loss of status too, if they're a leader.
Loss of
So
status.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
It's
so
just occurred to
it's-
me. I had this story that it was a role morality thing,
Right.
but it could easily be this alternative explanation.
But it seems to me there are two alternative explanations. One is just ejection from the group, and the other is loss of status within the group. So the average member might be,
Yeah.
extruded
Low
from the
status
group.
anyway.
Yeah. So, yes, Corey.
Thank you. It's really. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I liked Professor Neblo when you said, I like the interpretations you were giving. Sort of see that the people who weren't believing in the science weren't necessarily crazy, and you probably both know more of the research that you've talked about a little bit, but the place of ideology and of values in shaping people's position on the science. So kind of in my naive view, a reason why a lot of people, libertarians or so on, don't believe in the science of climate change is because the solution to climate change threatens values that they hold very dear. And so that it seems to be, right, and it's not crazy to be afraid of believing something that threatens your values. So how do we shape science communication so that it doesn't just just give people more facts, but to do it in a way that will kind of contour things away around the way these values shape people's beliefs?
So, first, I think your point about the solution being disagreeable, and therefore they sort of just reject the whole science, is a really key point, and one that maybe we could have made more strongly as we've been going along here. One of the things I've heard, like with climate change, people are starting to talk about, are there solutions to climate change that maybe people who are more liberal don't like as much, but that actually might appeal to people who are more libertarian? So things like nuclear power, for example. That's a solution that's actually more acceptable to somebody who comes from more of a libertarian kind of background. And that starting to talk about those kind of solutions might actually be quite helpful. The other thing I've heard, if you talk to, there apparently are, so I have a friend who does research with farmers. She's a professor here at Ohio State. And one of the things that she's talked about is some of the farmers that she works with will systematically reject the idea of climate change while putting in mitigation efforts against climate change all at the same time. To some extent, you don't, in my opinion, you don't really necessarily have to believe that it's human caused if that goes against your whole belief system. But there's a problem happening, and what are the good solutions to it? In the farming case, there's not necessarily anything like what you brought up. There's not necessarily solutions that go against someone's political beliefs. So I think that's not as much of a problem for them. But coming up with, being solution focused, and maybe being solution focused in ways that are more appealing either to a broader array of people or to the people who are really against what's happening, I think could be a very good way to proceed.
Thanks for your question. And the thing that it pops up for me is more of a philosophical question, but it's one that I've been struggling with. So I invoke coherence, and coherence being sort of an unimpeachable cognitive sort of virtue. But then there's the question of, is there an asymmetry between building coherence in our belief systems between facts and values? We want sort of our action-oriented value commitments to be grounded in facts. Now, certain philosophical positions would say, yeah, there's an asymmetry. It's a decisive asymmetry, and that the action implications of our value commitments have to defer to our factual beliefs. And there are other approaches that I think that would say, yeah, there's an asymmetry, but it's a more complicated relationship than we might think, which is, that your action commitments have to adapt and your value commitments don't have to adapt at all. And I'm very interested in that question. Philip Kitcher, I think, has interesting things to say along these lines. Hillary Putnam, who's now passed, but had interesting things to say along these lines. I'm just sort of beginning to scratch this literature a little bit, but I think it raises an interesting question, and I'm not. That's a moving target. I'm open to being persuaded on that.
I think there's a radical critique of all of this that could be made on the basis of brain science, and I think having a radical critique that could be made of all this on the basis of brain science and having a coherent idea of what causes behavior based on. But nonetheless, is the presumption here that we're going to have to wait to solve serious problems with the best information until the 77% who believe in alien visitations start to answer differently on questionnaires? I mean, are you expecting, is there a presumption here that the 70% of the American public that believes in alien visitation are going to somehow change their attitudes or their behaviors on this? I'm
not sure it actually matters in terms of coming up with solutions for some of these things.
Okay, so whether what they believe is irrelevant to what they do, or?
So I guess I would change the focus a little bit. I think that we do better as a society if people understand enough of science to be able to take actions that are in the best interests of themselves, but also of society. And hopefully those two come together.
Isn't that an empirical question? Isn't that either that's an idealistic notion or it's an empirical question?
It's an idealistic notion that I think we should get towards empirically. I think we're not there. We don't know enough about how to communicate science at this point. We sort of scratched the surface, but one of the issues in science communication is that we've scratched the surface a little bit in a bunch of different disparate fields that don't talk to one another. So I had never read Michael's work before this. I should have. Now I've read some of it, but then there are people in communication. There are people in all kinds of diverse fields who are doing a little bit on science communication, a lot as an individual, but a little bit as a field. But it hasn't come together. So there's actually a movement now, starting with the, I don't know that it's starting with, but there's a movement now that the National Academies of Science is in part leading, trying to bring those fields together a little bit better.
But is that evidence-based or faith-based?
Is what evidence-based?
Are these efforts evidence-based or faith-based? Are these idealistic notions, or is there evidence that you can communicate science with the 7% of people who believe in it?
Oh,
Now I'm a marketer.
so there's.
I'm a marketer, so in my day job I communicate. I would posit it cannot be done.
There's some evidence. I don't think that there's any evidence. I can't think of any evidence in climate change specifically. There's evidence in medical decision making that you can absolutely better communicate about the science of medicine, activate people more in terms of taking care of themselves, and they become healthier. It's more. I'm saying it as if it's a causal model. It's actually more correlational, and people are working on the causal side of it. But it looks like that's true in that field at least.
So we agree it's an empirical question.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's what we'd like.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're scientists too.
I agree too.
Chris in the back.
So one of the problems with climate change is that even if you believe in it, it kind of feels like there's nothing that you as an individual can do. And so I wondered if Professor Peters had found in her research if there was any significant variation in the uptake of the information when it was much more salient to an individual's behavior. For example, tobacco was mentioned, or wearing seatbelts or something like that. It seems like in those cases, if individuals are able to overcome certain heuristic biases, then they have a real motivation to do that, because the claim is that your life is at stake, say, in the next few years, whereas we might not see people reflecting with the same motivation in these more theoretical topics. So have you found any variation like that, or do you think that that's a idealistic theory?
Yeah. So I think it varies by domain. Tobacco, there are particular problems with addiction. Addiction is super hard to overcome. People have to try about 7 times to quit before they're actually able to. And so there you can increase how much people know about the risks. And it does help more people quit, but it's a pretty small effect. In health, I think the effects can be stronger because you don't have the same kind of addictive nature of tobacco. You don't have the same kind of motivated cognitions and that wanting to stay a part of your tribe that you have in areas like climate change. And as you pointed out, in climate change, the solutions are, it's difficult to know, can I make a difference? So in medicine, I think you can see it, but it's a way simpler domain. One of the other issues in climate change that's probably also different in its complexity compared to medicine is there's some data that suggests that once people take one step in climate change, so I start to recycle. Well, I've taken care now of all of my need to do anything about climate change, and people don't take the next steps. Where probably what we want them to be doing is taking a group of steps. We want them to be recycling, but we also want them to reduce their carbon footprint in a variety of ways. But what happens is when you do one thing, the data suggests that you kind of use up your need to do something for climate change. They have a much nicer way of saying it, but I can't quite come up with the words that they used in the paper. But I think it's particularly problematic in climate change, I think, because there's this whole plethora of things that could be done, and and people aren't quite sure which one might I do that will then make a difference.
Mike?
So just real quickly, I would say at the group level in deliberative sort of forums, in formal deliberative forums, it's really surprising how much you can get people that don't have a direct dog in the fight to care about an issue as long as other people are implicated in the issue. Now, that's not exactly your question because you're talking about climate change and we're all in that boat together. But I will say one of the things that we find is that there are really big effects on collective efficacy, individual and collective senses of efficacy after deliberation. In one study we had, it was 25% of the scale. The treatment effect was 25% of the entire scale.
What exactly is it? So that when people went through a kind of deliberative democracy kind of process, their perceptions of how much efficacy do I have increased substantially?
So there's in politics, there's two kinds of efficacy, external and internal. External is the notion that I can make my voice heard and people that are empowered will listen to me and respond. That went up hugely in ours. The internal efficacy was a really fascinating result. There was no plenary effect, but we talked about this a little, and this might be a statistical artifact, I have to check it. Ellen already usefully. But the facial result was that there was a variance compression, meaning the people who were like, oh, everybody knows what to be done, it's just a matter of summoning the political will, were like, whoa, this is complicated. And the people who are like, oh, I'm just a caveman, I can't understand this, there's nothing I can do, were like, no, I got it. I was able to get my points across. And so there was a compression movement towards the middle on that. And I agree, that could be we haven't run out the ground balls on that statistically. But those, I think, speak to the question of, so there are two things. One, whether this is important to me directly, and one, whether I feel efficacious about being able to tackle the problem, even if it is important to me.
It's coming.
So I wanted to go back to I want to go back to the question about us being liberals, doing science that also prove the liberal agenda. Is that a problem? That we talk a lot about climate change, for example. We say that we know we're right. We're liberals. We know that climate change is happening. The problem here is that the conservatives, they don't understand our science. So we need to teach them the right thing. Is there a democratic problem at all? As you see in that, is there issues that we could maybe focus on, saying that these are things that science prove that liberals don't acknowledge and don't understand? Is there anything like that? Do you have an example, or is it only the conservatives that don't understand science?
I mean, but you brought up one example of, I think, GMOs you brought up.
GMOs, yeah.
Was there another
With-
one that you brought up too?
Well, what I've seen is that the anti-vaxxer stuff is sort of spread across the political spectrum. It's not specifically left and right. But
Yeah, it depends.
the concern that GMO foods are unhealthy to eat is something that's found much more often. There are other concerns about GMO foods, but that it's unhealthy to eat is found much more often on the left than on the right. And the science, at least what I've seen, suggests that there's no reason to believe that there are health risks from eating GMO foods.
Could I quibble a little bit with your formulation? I don't think it's the case that the conservatives differentially don't understand science. I think in a first order sense, the liberals have just as much trouble understanding first order science. I think that there might be a partial effect of conservatives trusting the scientific community a little bit less under certain particular circumstances. And what I've tried to suggest is that that's not necessarily crazy.
There's even just to go along with that
Yeah.
point, there's even some data that suggests if you ask the American public, I'm trying to remember the formulation of the question, so something to the extent of, is human-caused climate change happening? You get this big political divide. But if you ask the question in a slightly different way, do climate scientists believe that human-caused climate change is happening? The political divide goes away. Everybody understands what climate scientists believe, but they're not trusting the data. They don't themselves believe that human-caused climate change is occurring. And so it doesn't seem to be the case. So it doesn't seem to be the case even on climate change per se, that one group necessarily understands less than the other group. I don't know what happens at the detail level. If you look like, more at the very detail of climate change. But I have to say, I don't know that much about the detail of it myself.
Yeah.
But I have strongly believed the 97% of climate scientists who say that it's human-caused and that it's occurring. And I strongly believe the anecdotal evidence that I see in the paper that there seem to be changes that are happening that are important, and sea levels rising. So I don't know how much that gets. So in terms of your question, you're asking a tough question, and you know this. By the way, this is Per Bjälkebring from Sweden, and this is his first day here, and he's doing this to me. Just want to point that out. He has 3 years to spend in my lab. What do you think? I mean, what's your viewpoint on it?
I think that this discussion and having people study how we can convince them to believe what we want is what makes conservatives not trust science as well. That if they
But what do you do?
Huh?
What do you do then?
I would agree. Winston Churchill said that, and with looking at this election, the best argument against democracy is just to go out and speak to the average voter. That's what he allegedly said. But I do believe that democracy stems from everyone's, maybe I should call it everyone's combined stupidity. That all our bad ideas together is better than one person's good idea. And that's why democracies work better than dictatorship. So maybe having people with different opinions is better than the opposite. Then America, with only 2 parties that are at each other just because they want to, is not maybe the best political system. But in other countries where we have a lot of different parties where they need to agree, it usually works very well.
So given how quickly Rick Livingston grabbed the mic and when he did, I suspect he's going to disabuse me of some of my very quickly researched claims about GMO foods. So.
I have nothing to say about GMO foods, Don. No, I think my concern picks up a little bit on this, which is with sort of the loose way we use the term we. Sometimes to include ourselves and sometimes to refer to those people whom we study and who are not part of it. So I guess my question, which is a kind of provocation, is in a democracy, are there limits to what science can tell us? Are there any limits to where the scientific evidence should be relevant?
I assume you're getting this one.
Yeah. I was hoping you'd first. No. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. So there's a couple of ways that you might interpret it. So is the question, in a democracy, are there any limits to the factual authoritativeness of science? I think my answer is no. That science is science, and what it uncovers about the world is it's the single best way we have of discovering factual propositions about the world that will stand up to practice and critical scrutiny over time. And in that sense, democracy does not trump science. If the question is, and now there could be a couple of things, are there reasonable inputs about what we should be pursuing as questions of science in democracies? Certainly from a funding standpoint, I have no problem with emphases and things along those lines. On the margins, even regulation of, say, genetic cloning and other sorts of things, I think democracies can reasonably just restrict our ability to pursue certain kinds of scientific projects in questions. But I think what you meant, and you can tell me in a clarification, what I think what you meant is, are there limits to the action guiding force of what scientists tell us vis-a-vis public policy and democratic wills? And there, I think the answer is absolutely. That any policy is going to have factual, that a policy, the grounds for pursuing a policy are an argument, and premises or moves within that argument are going to combine factual and value-oriented components, and that a democracy might reasonably say, yes, climate, well, I should be careful here about exactly how I say this. Peers will jump out of his seat at me. In principle, a democracy could say, yes, you climate scientists are right, we're going up rapidly, but say, no, 2 degrees is not the stopping point. We're just going to discount the future in a way that might seem to us in this room is irresponsible. Now, I say that in principle. I think that there are, it's to illustrate the point that one could accept the seeming valence of the facts about what we should do, and the democracies could say, no, there are these other moves in the argument that contradict the seeming action implications of the factual propositions that are being put forward. Does that make sense? You don't have to agree with it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It doesn't answer my question, but I can see where you're going.
Okay. Do you want to take a stab at that, Ellen?
Sure. So I think about science as producing facts and best predictions for the future based on whatever is factually known today, with facts, of course, being uncertain. I think Parr a little bit is questioning either whether people are producing the best science or whether it's driven by their preconceived notions. But let me leave that behind for just 1 minute. Let's just assume for a minute that science produces the best facts available, and we'll leave what Parr's suggestion off to the side for a second. In the end, if we're making choices as a society or as individuals, I think that science doesn't have a limit, other than the limits of science itself, that it is uncertain. It provides only that. It only provides information. And when you're actually making decisions, whether it's as an individual or it's for a society, I think that it is better for us as a society and as individuals to understand that science as best we can, or to be able to rely on people who understand that science as best possible. But in the end, the decisions have to be made based on values and preferences. So I tend to study more.
Is it more important to understand the science or to understand the uncertainty of science?
That is science. So uncertainty is endemic in the science. There's no way to separate them.
So that's then the limit.
That is absolutely a limit of science, absolutely. But what I was saying too is that there's another limit of science when it comes to actually making decisions and choices. That we can't just rely on science. We can't just have the scientists tell us, whether it's one of us or somebody else, tell us you should do this. We need to use those facts that are produced, because all they are facts, and they're uncertain facts, in combination with what's the value. So I study more medical decision making than I do climate science kinds of issues. And in medical decision making, patients often have to make choices between something that might extend their life but reduce their quality of life. And at that point, the doctor can tell you maybe what he or she thinks you should do, but it's up to you at that point. How much is it going to bother you to lose your hair? How much is it, those are values at that point and preferences that have to be taken together with the facts. Now that I know this might happen if I do this, what do I prefer? And my preferences also are kind of uncertain. I'm not really positive what I want because I've never experienced it. So you take this uncertain science in combination with these uncertain preferences, and there we have the human condition, and we just do the best we can.
We have time for one more question. I think we have.
Okay, so I found Professor Peter's statements about our understanding of science, or the general understanding of science in relation to numbers, very interesting. And I was wondering, is there any way for there to be an improvement in how we understand numbers and statistics in understanding science and decision making, or are there alternatives to the layman's, understanding of science, as opposed to just defaulting to our emotions?
Yeah, so I love your question. This is what we do in my lab. So we have, there's a lot of things you can do. There are, with Louise Mayer and Mary Kate Tompkins, who I can't see in the crowd, they're here, one of them is here somewhere. We've looked at a lot of different ways that communicators can present numeric information to people so that it's better understood and so that it's better used. Those are short-term solutions. There are things we can do in climate change, in medicine, and other kinds of domains where we can present numeric information in ways that reduce the cognitive effort to understand what it is, that provide more evaluative meaning so that you understand not just what the number is, but what does it mean for the decision at hand, that draw more attention to important information and downplay less important information. There are things you can do short-term to present information so that it's better understood and used. There are also, we've been working recently looking at, are there ways that we can intervene with adults, like with college students, and teach them better numeric abilities so that you not only make things easier, but you make the people better. I would encourage any of you who are still in school or even not still in school, go take some classes. Take some classes. If you're not good at arithmetic, start there. Take some classes in probability. These kinds of statistical literacy issues are really important, and you will probably improve both your health and your wealth long term as an individual if you know more about numbers. So I'd encourage all of you to do that. And I have probably 5 more lectures I could give on that, so I'll stop.
Mike, do you?
I have nothing to add.
That was custom made for me.
Yeah, that was very much in Ellen's wheelhouse.
Yeah. So before we thank our speakers, I want to bring to your attention a working group that some of you may be interested in, a working group on science and values. It's going to have its first organizational meeting on October 18th. And Chris Pincock, who, if you'd stand for 1 second, Chris, there, he has a few flyers there if you're by the door, I'm sorry. So grab those, and if they run out, you can email me, or you can look Chris up, Chris Pincock in our department, and email him to get more information about that. Now, please join me in thanking both Mike Neblo and Ellen Peters for a terrific. Thank you so much for coming.